A website is never finished, especially a B2B tech website. Welcome to ForwardSlash, the podcast that explores how B2B tech companies can leverage their websites to achieve fast, efficient, predictable, and scalable growth. In each episode, I take a big issue affecting the B2B tech landscape and then pick the brains of marketing leaders around the world to learn how the issue affects the questions B2B tech marketers should be asking about their websites and how to answer them. Let's get into it.
Francis Brero, co-founder and chief product officer at MadKudu, which is a platform that helps SaaS companies increase conversion rates, upsells, and customer retention. Just quite an established thought leader in the B2B marketing community in general. Really excited to have you on today, man. How's it going?
Yeah, super excited to be here. Thanks for hosting me.
Of course. I've been following you for some time now, and you've got a lot of interesting perspectives on data-backed perspectives on PLG and really just like go-to-market motion, best practices, data management, and how it all relates to kind of experiences and ABM or ABX, whatever have you, which we're going to dive into today. But let's just start with an easy one. If you want to tell me about MadKudu, what it is, who it's for, why they should care about it, and why you founded it.
The founding story was pretty interesting. My co-founder and I got contacted by a CMO that we worked with in our past lives, and he was looking to hire a data scientist for his company within the marketing team, and we thought that was pretty odd. That was a few years ago when PLG wasn't really a coined term. This is at a competitor of InVision. And we kind of challenged the idea, why would you need a data scientist to do this? We have a lot of people using the product, and we're trying to find, source opportunities for pipeline from that. And it's just a lot of data to go through. And my marketing team doesn't have the skills to go through all that data and, run experiments and find opportunities. And we thought that's interesting because kind of phase one of, the digital revolution is kind of an infrastructure change where we moved everything away from, being installed on mainframe servers all the way to being installed on the cloud. And that was kind of more of almost purely technical kind of revolution, where it was super easy now to spin up software and to get it into the cloud, into the hands of your customers without your customers having to install anything crazy. So that actually led to a new form of go-to-market where it's, it was much easier to sell, right? If you compare Oracle sales compared to Salesforce sales, you were able to do transactions online in a more transactional manner. And then if you go one step further, the ability to deploy software on the cloud super easily means that you can start having a little bit more of that consumer experience where you're almost deploying software on a user basis for them to try it out before they buy it. And that's really what PLG is to some extent, right? It's having a new way to go to market that puts the product front and center. And that has been made possible through a lot of the technical innovations that happened, the last 15, 20 years. And so as we were seeing that, we're starting to realize, this is something that's here to stay. And it's just going to create more complexity in go-to-market, because now companies are going to have traditional sales, take people out, steak dinner kind of stuff. You're still going to have the more transactional of over the phone and, inside sales reps. And there's going to be this new thing of PLG. And there really isn't any tool out there that allows go-to-market teams to manipulate data to create segmentation without the need for engineers. And so that's why we started MadKudu. And it's one of the reasons why we were able to, have awesome customers in the early days. And people like Figma, MongoDB, InVision, Segment, they saw the value in having a tool that allowed them to manipulate the data for go-to-market segmentation without needing engineers all the time. And that's something that is critical. And I think we'll talk about this, but I value velocity of iteration as a proxy for accuracy. I think too often we think that, we're going to try and build the perfect solution for something. And any marketer knows that being able to iterate on a campaign is what leads you to having the best campaign, rather than spending millions of hours brainstorming in a room in order to build the perfect campaign that you ship out. Like, you need to do user feedback, and the best way to do user feedback is to put it out there and iterate.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Beautifully said. Can I ask how MadKudu does it? Like, what's the unique selling proposition there? What's the mechanic of the product, I guess?
Yeah, on our end, like the idea is really to say, like, there's an element of bringing all the data in. That's pretty straightforward. I mean, we're kind of blessed in B2B SaaS that there's like really strong tech concentration, right? Like Salesforce, HubSpot, Marketo, Eloqua covers like the vast majority of the CRM and map. And then on the data side, there aren't that many analytics tools. I mean, Amplitude, Mixpanel, Segment, pretty much done with it. And on the data warehouse side, like Redshift, BigQuery, and Snowflake also cover a big majority. So once you have connectors to those systems, it's actually pretty easy to bring data in. And then we have a system essentially that has learned from all of our existing customers how to configure, how to identify what is a meaningful action, what is a conversion. And so from that, it's going to generate some segmentation out of the box based on your data. And
Gotcha.
It gives the ability to the go-to-market team to go and change those. So really the idea is that it's a no-code interface, and people can modify all the segmentation pretty easily and do like fairly, like from very simple to very sophisticated things. But one of the big, I guess, like value adds there is the idea that the platform is very prescriptive, right? It comes up with a bunch of segmentation. It recommends things to do based on past customers it's seen.
Got it. Okay, awesome. Thanks for taking that. Yeah, I can see how that'd be really useful. As you said, just to like speed up that iterative process and just learn more quickly. Cool. So I'd like to shift into kind of the state of PLG, if you will. And I'd first like to frame my first question with just like the reality of the B2B SaaS tech landscape in 2023. Especially if we're talking about MarTech or sales tech, right? It's hyper competitive markets, shrinking markets, longer sales cycles with bigger buyer groups now, just to combat bad purchases, if you will. Just generally harder to open wallets than it was the past couple of years. And then on top of that is the whole idea of dark funnel and dark social, and how most of the journey is happening behind the scenes. And this reality, it's pushing B2B SaaS tech leadership to drive for more cost-effective acquisition. PLG is in the spotlight, right? But you recently stated in a LinkedIn article about how PLG is a strategy that uses a SaaS product to accelerate a part of the customer journey. Keyword part. And I'm bringing in these 4 key learnings that you relatively recently came away with at an event discussion around PLG that I found really interesting. The first, which addresses this very point, which is PLG doesn't work in a vacuum. Can you take me through that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the hype of PLG is, I wouldn't say gone, but I definitely feel like the struggles of 2023 have led a lot of CMOs and board members to go back to what they know, which is like enterprise. Like ABM, I feel is getting like is almost like more popular these last few months than PLG, just because it's like, oh my God, we absolutely need some like big pipeline. And because, as you're saying, like people are not opening their wallets, like PLG, which generally takes a little bit longer. I think it's like PLG is a long-term play, right? You need to get people to use the product, build that kind of like strong community and user base before you can start monetizing it. Like ABM, it's like fairly straightforward. It's like, okay, who are the accounts that are in market, and like get reps to go and talk to them to generate pipe. So you feel like you get a much faster time to pipe. But anyway, so I feel like there's like something there that's happening in the market where the board is pushing on a lot of companies to like generate pipe quickly with ABM. And I think that's where it potentially is a mistake, because I do think that PLG in the long run is going to really help companies that survive this kind of these hard times in SaaS, because it's going to create a lot of usage from the people who actually are going to be, the consumers and users of the product. And that creates a ton of brand awareness within organizations. So what I meant by PLG doesn't live in a vacuum is that you can get a bunch of users to adopt your product if the buyer, the person like signing the check, the person that's responsible for the budget, doesn't understand what your product does, nor what kind of value it brings to the users. You're never going to close that deal, right? You might get a few people swiping their credit card, but that's not going to lead you to enterprise pipeline and enterprise revenue. And so that's why it's really critical to understand that when we're selling to organizations, which is what we do in B2B, there's multiple stakeholders, and different stakeholders are going to have different affinities to different journeys. So take the kind of oversimplistic example, developers love to use products. Like a developer is not going to be happy answering a cold call. Like if you're trying to cold call developers, good luck. It's probably going to be pretty rough whenever someone picks up the phone. So, product led, really great, right? Like get people to like build something or try it out, get into the console, all that kind of stuff. Now, if you're going after, ahead of, let's say, a BDR manager, BDR managers respond really well to cold calls. Like they actually pick up the phone and they will respond well to a good pitch. They are not super big fans of filling in a form or trying out a product. And on the flip side, then you have marketers, they hate being called, and they're actually pretty much okay filling in forms. So that kind of like traditional inbound is going to be a good fit for them. The outbound is good for sales. And then PLG is excellent, if not the only thing that works for developers. And so what's really interesting is that that's kind of like departments, but then even within the organization, like the CIO, who's kind of the IT buyer, is more likely to fill in a form or respond to a cold call than he is to sign up for free for a product. And so understanding that what people do in the product is kind of relevant to them, but there's still a lot of decision makers within the organization that you need to convince. And that needs to happen, and you need to leverage that information to understand which accounts are actually ready to convert. And too many companies focus on just like PLG. We hear about like PLG CRM companies. There's like ABM companies that focus only on ABM. But at the end of the day, the CIO might be looking at some ads. You have people using the product, and you might have a manager who's going to join a webinar to hear about how does this product help increase productivity within my team. And like all of these combined is what gives you a good idea as to where this company is with regards to buying your product. And if you only focus on one thing, the PLG part, you're missing the big picture. And that I think is something that is a little bit dangerous these days, because there are too many vendors that are really just pitching their part of the story. And thankfully marketers, like I think understand it's a bit broader than this, but I think it's really important to always bring it back to the context that PLG is a portion of the journey for a portion of the account.
Gotcha. And the second point, it heavily overlaps with this, but I think it brings to light some different insight. And that's that it just simply understand your buyer group, know who they are, know where they are. You have an interesting metaphor that you use for Lord of the Rings. If you can take me through that really briefly.
Yeah. I mean, it's very similar to what I was saying, whereas the CIO and like different people playing different roles. Like the analogy I use to try and get people to visualize this is comparing the buyer's journey of an account with the story, the plot of the Lord of the Rings. What's interesting, the Lord of the Rings is like fairly straightforward story of a fellowship that wants to destroy a ring. Like not that complicated. Bunch of people, they get together, there's this thing, they have to destroy it somewhere else. And what's really interesting when you look at there's a great visual of what that storyline looks like that was done by XKCD. And there's a lot of, the fellowship gets split up, they go into different groups. And what's really interesting is that each of these groups play a critical role in the overall story. and if you remove one of them, then the whole story falls apart. And you even have people that have conflicting interests within the story, right? So Boromir is a really good example because he wants to take the ring for Gondor and he wants to bring it back and have it for himself. And so even though he is a part of this thing, he's like a little bit competitive. And then, in the end, he kind of, spoiler alert, sacrifices himself to save the fellowship for the 3 people here that, haven't seen the movie or read the book. But there's something similar happening in organizations, right? You have these people that are part of the initial meeting, and then you start realizing, ooh, these people have a conflicting interest because they have a relationship with someone else, like their uncle knows the founder of this other thing, or they want to use the budget for this other initiative that they think is more important to them. And so understanding who those players are is really critical. And at the same time, still within the analogy, you have Gandalf, who's the instigator of this whole thing. He's the one who kind of like triggers everything. And the funny thing is he's absent for a fairly long amount of time, but then he comes like in some like very critical moments to save the day. And so that's kind of your, to some extent, kind of the executive champion that isn't necessarily on the forefront of everything, but is critical to make sure the journey moves forward. So to some extent, like I've coach some of our customers to try and think of, putting the fellowship as a list of kind of personas and trying to figure out in deal cycles, like who are the typical people that would fit into these personas? Like who's the Gandalf of this? Like who's this kind of executive champion that's going to instigate and going to be the person who moves everything forward? Who's the person like the actual champion who's going to be like pulling the deal through and kind of like the day-to-day person that we're going to be speaking with? Who's the Samwise Gamgee in there? Anyway, and like it's funny because like using that story makes it a little bit easier to try and like connect things together, and it makes it a little bit less abstract than a lot of the frameworks that I've seen people work through.
There's a lot there. But I feel it's also a pretty simple idea, right? And I guess I'm kind of curious from your perspective. And this is mostly going to be for like large enterprise deals, right? When you have these large buyer groups, and I think it was Latane Conant, who is a Six Senses CMO, who I think it was last year noticed, or at the beginning of this year, noticed that the buyer group for their product actually started at 5 and then increased to like 8 or 9 from Q1 to Q2. And if you think about that, it's just like, yeah, duh, right? Really, like this is a complex product. We need different perspectives and inputs. And it's going to touch more departments, if you will. Why is it hard to grasp this idea that it's like an MQL is not just if one guy comes through, one person comes through it in ebook, they're not ready to be sent to sales. But I feel like we understand this, but is it that we're just lazy? Is it that we just think we might get lucky?
There's a part of it. Yeah, I think there's a part of it. I think to some extent, HubSpot pushed for so long the idea of like inbound marketing and how, it's just like fairly simple. And then we have the simplified idea of, the MQL that generates like an opportunity, and then everything is like pretty straightforward from there. I do think PLG adds a little bit of complexity just because the users are now included in here. So it's less about like selling to, like before when you were in the world of like RFPs, you're really just selling to the CIO groups. And then we went into more transactional sell where we were selling to the functional buyer, typically your VP or director of the organization you're selling to. And now we end up, having to talk with the users, like the day-to-day kind of champions, the functional buyer, and typically, especially tools like Six Sense or like any tool that's like has a bit of an enterprise value prop, or when you're closing deals like over 50K nowadays, like you're also going to have to talk to the CFO, right? Like the CFO part of the org is going to be asking like, what kind of ROI can we expect? Like, how can I make sure I can justify this budget to the board that we're carving out? And then you still have CIOs who are going to be in charge of asking, with all the compliance stuff that's happened, all the regulatory changes that we've had recently, just making sure, hey, like, does this work with our DPA? Does it work with, all the new regulation, right? CCPA comes into play. Now Virginia is coming out with their own law. Colorado is doing the same. I mean, Europe has been doing it for a while. So there's yeah, we're maturing as an industry, I think, on B2B SaaS tech. And it
Sure.
also means that like compliance is like getting a little bit harder. But yeah, I think a lot of this used to be hidden because the CIO group would be kind of pushing everything forward, and then adoption was the challenge post sales. Now it's almost like a lot of the challenges of adoption and getting buy-in from the internal stakeholders that used to happen post sales has now shifted to pre-sales, which I think is something interesting because it probably also is the consequence of a lot of shelfware, especially nowadays, right? Like 2021, everything was like skyrocketing to the moon. We were all geniuses investing into GameStonk and into the crypto world, and like everyone was a trading genius, right? So you could just like spend money left and right. Now we're starting to wonder, okay, like out of all of this shelfware, like what do we keep, what do we not keep, and how do we become a little bit more careful about when we're buying something, making sure that we have the people within the organization to manage the tech and actually roll it out and be successful with it. And we're less likely to run large scale experiments that have like big budget line items. And so I think there's also a component there for 2023 where it's going to be a lot more of what used to happen post sales is moving into pre-sales and convincing the organization this is the right thing to do.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, that all makes sense. Thanks for taking me through that. Another one of the key findings has to do with data management, and I think all of these there's overlap between all of them. But this could upset potentially some listeners. I really like this one. Self input data is garbage. I always thought that this was a little voice in the back of my head that was just like, okay, should we really be trusting this? And I feel like I'm not the only one about it, but it was like, it's there, we've got it. It makes us feel sort of safe. So let's use it. What was the finding behind that one?
So there were a couple instances where we saw this, and recently I was talking to VP of growth of a B2 dev company, and the funny thing was that he ran a quick analysis on. So they have one of the drop-down fields that they have when you sign up for the product is you say, are you planning on using the product for yourself? Or sorry, it's like the size of your organization. Is it just yourself, under 10 people, 10 to 100, over 100 people? The best predictor of the account turning into an enterprise account was people declaring that it was just for themselves. It's like the exact opposite of what you'd expect. So basically, all the people who came from large organizations, or like the vast majority, would say it was just themselves, even though they were using a corporate email. Like someone from like IBM would sign up and say, "Oh, I'm just a company of myself." And yeah, I mean, we're again, like, if you're trying to sign up for the product, like you just want to get access to the product, you want to make sure it fits your need. Going through a dropdown, you're just going to pick the first value. And this is something that Sean Klaus at Atlassian actually ran a test on. So in Jira, when you would sign up, it would ask you what was your job title. And the idea was like, if we know your job title or kind of the role, then they would tailor the onboarding accordingly. So what was interesting was that they had like a strong value prop behind it. They're saying like, if you're a product manager, you're not going to use Jira the same way as if you're a developer or an SRE or an engineering manager. And so they wanted to tailor that onboarding. They made that clear. They're like, hey, we want to tailor your onboarding. Tell us what your role is within the organization. And what was funny is that over a few weeks, they changed the order of the dropdown. The distribution of values was always the same based on the number. Like value number 1 always had the highest number, then value number 2, then like some other one. And the distribution stayed the same, even though they were scrambling the actual like text behind it. And so at that point, they realized, okay, this is absolutely worthless because whatever we put as number 1 is going to be the thing people click on. And so we might be giving a product manager onboarding to an engineering manager. And anyway, I have like countless examples of this, but the long story short there is that there's a bunch of enrichment vendors that are pretty good out there. I also think there's potentially a better time to ask for self-input data, right? When you haven't gotten value, like you haven't given me value as a user. don't ask for more. Like I already gave you my corporate email address. Don't go asking for the name of my kids, my dog, my age, all that stuff. Like I'll give you that later when I'm comfortable enough with your product and the value it's giving me that I feel like, yeah, sure. I'm now willing to give because I got. And I think this is something that's just going to keep on, moving forward, right? Like forms are getting shorter, thank God. And what we consistently see is that the longer the form, the worse the conversion rate. And the worst part is like, first off, the data, the conversion rate is worse and the data we're getting is not useful. So why are we still doing this? Like, I think this is just a relic of, like times that have been gone, for a long time.
I still see Salesforce's form in my nightmares. I think for me, I that's the first one that comes to mind because I remember my experience like 10 years ago. I filled out an ebook and there was probably 20 fields, and it was pretty useful back in the day, the content. So I provided it, but over time, as like content, just like the quality, once people realized just what kind of a hack this was, and it wasn't being tied to like quality content, I myself started inputting crap data on this form just so I could get it done and receive access to it. So yeah, that completely makes sense. Related to that is the fourth key insight, and that's PLG, product usage skews SMB, which I thought was really interesting. Can you take me through that?
Yeah, it's funny because I literally talked about this again with one of our customers today. So this was a really good point that, something that we've seen, and Thomas Tongus actually brought it up again when he did. So he had a really good analysis that he did on free trials. And he did find that most companies that were selling to enterprises didn't rely as much on activity data as SMB. And when he looked back to his Google days, he remembered that most of the time when they built a model internally that was looking at activity, they found that the most active was SMB. And this makes a ton of sense, right? If, again, you're selling to startups and you're selling to, let's say, banks, just to make it extreme, the likelihood that a startup developer goes into your product, sets it up, starts playing around with it, pretty high. The probability that the developer at a bank logs in, connects their data, and starts doing something is incredibly low. And so that's one of the challenges, right? The bigger the organization is, exactly what we were talking about before, right? There's like a bigger buying committee. There's like compliance questions, like more regulated. You can't really just connect Salesforce and do something with it. Like can't connect Amplitude. It has like PII data. So you can't just like go around and test things. And so typically the risk is that if you have some kind of prioritization function that's going to look at, okay, let's find who are the most active users and hand them over to sales. That is a great motion for either self-serve or potentially like transactional deals. But when you're looking to close at the enterprise level, it tends to be, a little bit more complicated. And at least you want to separate the two by saying, at least let's identify who are the enterprise potential and who are the transactional potential companies. And then within those, we want to stack rank by activity. But if you just do a stack ranking by activity overall, you're always going to find that the smaller organizations are the ones that are the most active. And that's something that I've seen time and time again, where companies that are getting started with like PQLs, they trip on this every single time, because they're like, okay, let's get our PQLs, and the PQLs are like based on activity. And then the reps start telling them, well, I'm just like, I'm talking to great titles. Like it's like, like CTO or a VP of marketing, but it's like the VP of marketing of a 7-person company. Like that's not going to help me make enough commission, or this is not going to retire my quota. So, so it's not helping. And that's, again, something that we see over and over again.
Really interesting. That was just a bit of an eye opener, but completely logical also. But I think that's also a great segue into what I'd like to discuss next, which is a specific MadKudu case study around Lucid. And this is pretty much exactly what you were just talking about. You recently spoke at B2B MX, I'm actually in Phoenix. I unfortunately didn't have I couldn't make it, unfortunately, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about this case study. It sounds like there was a 60% increase in revenue from product generated leads. And this is a platform that has, I think, 1 million new user signups every month or quarter or something like that.
For months, yeah.
Can you take me through that case study and what you found, what they were doing wrong or what the problem they had and how they solved it?
Yeah, I think for them, so super successful product, like million-ish new signups per month, and getting a lot of traction across the board, right? So they have like super small teams using it, large enterprises using Lucid, and they have like multi-products and all that stuff. What was really interesting about Lucid is that they have a really smart team, very capable, and I guess like the biggest challenge they had is that their engineering team was in charge of building the different prioritization that was happening then in Marketo and in Salesforce. And this was like the typical case of you have a really solid engineering team and you're starting to think, okay, we need to figure out how to better prioritize out of all the users that we have, which are the ones that should be sent to sales. And so this always seems like a super easy thing. You're like, well, we have a database where we have all the activity and all the users. We're going to stack rank and then like start sending that kind of information into Marketo and into Salesforce then. It surprisingly is harder than it may seem. Like building that integration, like Marketo isn't made to support that kind of volume of data. And what's really interesting also is that there are very few engineers that have ever sold anything in their lives. And so they don't understand what, like some of the basic things that, you know, like a rep would catch automatically. They don't think about it, right? So very simple example. When you look at like the most active accounts within Lucid, you will find out a bunch of universities, thousands of like students who are using their .edu that are active. And this is not something that is going to be shocking to a developer. Like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm just like stack ranking based on domain and then handing that over to sales. If you're a sales rep, like trying to sell enterprise deals and we tell you, oh, most active account is Stanford.edu, you're like, okay, I'm done. Like this project is done for me. I'm just going to go and do something else. So you lose complete trust. And then what you want is ideally, you know, you want to take whatever feedback sales has, like, oh, let's actually remove nonprofits, schools, personal emails. Let's remove all that stuff and focus on, you know, sorting by activity accounts that have more than 1,000 employees. And then, you know, that's now a ticket for engineering. And engineers, they feel like they've built their thing. They had a sprint planning where they had to ship something. Now they're working on something else. They have to work on the product. And so every iteration would take a pretty long time. And it also meant that you have to space it out because then you have to make sure it's like prioritized in a sprint and done. And so the real challenge that Lucid was running into is that they didn't have that velocity of iteration, of being able to say, sales has feedback, they give it to MOPS, MOPS is able to make the change, deploy it, and then within like a few weeks, just being able to run through 7 or 10 cycles of these iterations. And when we came in, like that's what we delivered, right? This whole idea that their MOPS manager, Peter Kirk, was able to take all that feedback and on a weekly basis, he would have 3 meetings with the sales team in the early days, just like get feedback, make changes. And so very quickly they got to a point where the sales team was super excited and aligned with what was being served to them. And this was data backed. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Because like the data backed information meant that they were actually going off to things that were relevant. And marketing was able to provide them with the right kind of signals and the right kind of support for them to be bought into that motion. And that kind of sales and marketing alignment, I think, is really what's at the core of that increase in revenue. And it comes from the fact that there's the ability to iterate. Because as a salesperson, you give feedback to marketing. If you don't see a change, like you're very unlikely to give feedback again, right? You feel like you're just like I don't know, like screaming into a pillow and nothing's happening. And so then you just go about your life differently. So that I think is something that is very undervalued in how organizations think about their go-to-market stack. The pace of iteration and the velocity that you gain in your ability to iterate, I think is something that should be critical to the evaluation of any MarTech tool that's being brought into the stack. Like they're great tools like High Touch, DBT, they're awesome on the data side, but they're not tools that you can put into the hands of a marketer. Otherwise, they have to learn SQL, they have to learn how to commit stuff into GitHub. And sure, it works well, and data teams are super excited about being able to pipe data from the warehouse into Marketo, but they still have to write SQL. And that means you still have to go to a data team, you still have to go through sprint planning, and it slows down your pace of iteration, which means that you're less accurate. Like the faster you can change your aim, the more likely you are to hit a bullseye.
Gotcha. And apologies if this is a silly question, but just again to reiterate, this was MadKudu's no-code kind of solution that allowed marketers to do this. There's still an element of alignment there that has to happen between marketing and sales, whether it's like SLA based or like criteria, KPIs. That's still something that is going to change between companies, and that, or does MadKudu take like behaviors into account, and outside of those criteria, and it can still recommend perhaps like outliers? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. What's interesting is I would say SLAs are not really an alignment tool. They're an enforcement tool.
Sure.
They're basically marketing telling sales, yo, like you better do this. And so it creates this kind of tension. That's not alignment, right? When you force rules, the alignment that MadKudu allowed was the ability to iterate quickly, right? So, and then like we provide especially our marketing customers with kind of frameworks on like how to get feedback from sales, how to make sure that feedback is actionable, and how to potentially challenge that feedback. Because it's on the flip side, right? Like sales reps don't know everything either, right? They tend to have a lot of recency bias. So like if they close a deal with like a fintech company, then fintech is the industry to go after forever. And so you want to also like be able to challenge them a little bit and like, hey, yeah, great. Like fintech does work, but like we're also closing a ton of like manufacturing, and we're closing a ton in like MarTech. So like those are still core industries. And here's like some examples of deals that you closed recently that are valuable. So having that support to make it data backed means that the SLA is then something that can be agreed upon, because there's alignment of like what we're going after. And it's not like, hey, we're just going to force an SLA and no questions asked. Like you get the opportunity to discuss why as a rep, you should actually meet the SLA, because you're bought into what you're getting.
Awesome. Thanks for taking me through that. Now there was an ABX element to this case study. I would like to dive into that a little bit, specifically how the website kind of plays into an ABM experience, if we want to take this ABX approach rather than ABM. Can you clarify exactly what Lucid was able to accomplish with their ABM motion?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One of them was kind of like growing beyond the idea of PQLs, right? So the thing that we talked about early on, and saying, great, like we might have users that are very engaged, but again, if you have 2 people from Disney that are engaging like crazy with your product, that doesn't mean Disney is ready to become an enterprise account. And so there's like a broader question of how do you run ABM plays within these accounts. And because you're very typical kind of stuff right now, you're saying, okay, we have a few people that are engaged with an account. We need to start targeting with ads the people that are, again, like when we go back to the affinities, like now the functional buyer is likely to have affinity to a webinar that talks about why Lucid is going to help their team be more efficient. So we want to run ads for those people, and we want to run some really like top of funnel content for the IT buyer, so that when the conversation comes about why they should do consolidation and use Lucid for all of their design collaboration, then the IT person like knows about the brand, and like it's a fairly straightforward conversation. And then you want sales to be going after the functional buyers and trying to book meetings and like tell them about why this product is going to be super helpful for their team. So that's maybe more on the, I guess, like later stage ABM, because you're at the point where there are people from those accounts that are engaging with your product, and you're using that as a trigger to say, okay, this account is like fairly in market, and now we want to run our standard plays to propagate ourselves within the account. That was kind of the core one. And what was really interesting is using metadata, which is a tool that's like very much focused on the ad serving part of ABM. They were able to create a bunch of different audiences, say, okay, like what are the kind of enterprise accounts where we have a few active users, but we're looking for a functional buyer. So run ads for those, trying to get the functional buyer. What are those where we have activity from functional buyers, but we don't have the IT decision maker? So let's go run some ads for those. So kind of really like tailoring, like, are we missing Gandalf, or are we missing Boromir, or even like, do we have convincing Boromir? So those kind of ads were something that generated like really, really positive ROI compared to the more standard, which is going to, push ads for everyone within our target account list. And then on the website, there are a couple things that were really relevant, and one of the big ones, and this is actually something that that came from, the inspiration came from InVision, was changing the CTAs and changing the content library based on kind of this idea of like, were you a enterprise expected account or more of a self-serve, right? So that the main call to action would be a talk to sales versus get started. Depending, like you would always have like main call to action and minor call to action, and changing based on who you were. And this is something that we also ran with Segment back in the day, and we ran a pretty long A/B test on this. And what was really interesting was that the talk to sales call to action performed much better within the kind of enterprise space, but on the more SMB and mid-market, the talk to sales didn't perform as well as start a free trial. So there was like really a strong affinity, and we ran A/B tests on both of those groups. And you always had the two calls to actions, but one of them was the bigger one. So it was really interesting to see that, in this kind of what we identified as like potential enterprise buyers, like talk to sales was the call to action that worked better, even though this was a company that was known for being PLG. So that's like one of the things on the website that I think was interesting. So kind of changing the CTAs and changing the content libraries accordingly.
Thanks for taking me through that. I can totally see how that makes sense. So that just kind of falls in line with everything that we've been talking about. Just like personalization, understand your buyer journey, personalization is key. I want to lead into this ABX, AB experience idea, and how the website kind of plays into it. We've covered like a large portion of the buyer, the customer journey, right? Acquisition, activation, retention, even evangelism a little bit. I'm curious, given everything that we just talked about, given your title and what you do, what you're responsible for, where do you see websites kind of falling short? B2B tech, B2B SaaS, it's mostly acquisition, right? As you were saying, talk to sales, get a demo, free trial, what have you. But I feel like there's a lot of room for improvement for everything past that, whether it's activation all the way through to evangelism. I think you can even have evangelism without interacting with the product. Curious what your thoughts are there, what you wish you saw more on B2B tech websites.
Yeah, I think a good analogy for this is chatbots, where when you go onto, if you're a customer of a tool and you go to their website, the chatbot is still trying to sell you, still trying to book a meeting with an AE, right? And I think that's like a terrible experience, right? You're already a customer. Like you would rather have it be a support bot that's asking you, hey, how can I help you with this instance? And like having knowledge of potentially like what was the last page in the product that you were looking at before pinging you on this. And I think that kind of problem of lack of personalization kind of in the post sales world is probably one of the biggest things or the biggest gaps I see on the website, right? The website as a customer is no different than the website as a prospect. And that is kind of crazy because as a customer, I already know at a high level what you do. I would rather be educated towards like, what are other things I should be thinking about? Like, how are other customers similar to me getting value, and being a little bit more specific than the high level components. And I think that is something that this part of like customer marketing and post sales improvement is something that is going to evolve, I think, thanks to PLG, because with PLG, you get people much sooner into your product, much sooner customers to that extent. I think there's a lot more of that land and expand motion. And so because you have a strong expand motion, now the website has to carry its weight within that expand motion. And a way to do that is to make sure that it adapts to the customer journey and it starts speaking to the challenges and the opportunities of an existing landed customer. And I think it's pretty cool that marketers are starting to see their role kind of impact more of the post sales, or at least the post land experience, even though today it's a lot of growth marketing or growth marketers that kind of sit between product and marketing. But I do think that's a really exciting part of the future of B2B websites, where it's like really tailoring to the stage of the journey post sales.
Beautifully said. No, I completely agree. And we're really leaning into the jobs to be done approach here, and kind of thinking about not only the job that our ICP is trying to get done, but all of the little auxiliary jobs, if you will, that kind of can lead to the product and start that conversation earlier. But that's a conversation for another day. I've got a couple of kind of rapid fire questions here for you before we close out. The first is, who are your sources of inspiration? Who would you like our listeners to know about that you learn from?
I would say Elena Verna is definitely one of the top influencers, because she has a really, really good content out there. Guillaume Caban, still like a really strong inspiration, really good growth hacks that he then he's really, really smart in how he does a lot of his experiments. I would say those are probably the top two that I would recommend, at least on the like PLG growth side.
Any upcoming events that you're going to be speaking at or just attending?
I think SaaStr Europa is SaaStr in London is the next one. And yeah, I'm considering a few, but we'll see if travel allows.
Sure. Awesome. Man, Francis, this has been great. I've learned so much. Thank you for talking this through with me. This is going to be very valuable to our listeners that just know it. And I'm going to take this back to our agency and just start mulling over how we can kind of put this information to use. But regardless, this has been great. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to see what comes out of this.